Welcome, everyone, to our deep dive today. We're going to be exploring architectural ethics, those fascinating guidelines that shape the decisions architects make every day.
It goes way beyond just, designing pretty buildings.
Oh, absolutely. It's about responsibility, accountability,
Yeah,
and a commitment to doing what's right, not just what's easy.
exactly.
And what I find fascinating is that some of these principles have been around for centuries.
Yeah,
It's like the Hippocratic Oath, but for buildings.
that's a great comparison. Just like doctors pledge to do no harm, architects have that same responsibility to protect the public through their designs.
Right. Think about it. Buildings impact everything, from our safety and accessibility to the health of our communities and the planet.
Yeah, they really do.
That is a massive responsibility. So how do architects keep track of all these ethical considerations?
Well, that's where codes of conduct and ethics come into play. These codes provide a framework for ethical decision-making, outlining the standards of professional conduct expected of architects.
So it's like a rule book,
In a way,
but one that goes beyond just technical specifications and building codes.
you got it. These codes address things like conflicts of interest, honesty in client interactions, and responsibilities towards the environment and society.
I'm curious, are these codes like universal, or do they vary depending on where you are in the world?
So there are international organizations like the International Union of Architects that set kind of like global standards.
Okay.
But then each country, often even individual regions, will have their own specific codes and regulations tailored to their own contexts.
So it's a system that's always evolving,
Yeah,
responding to new challenges and developments in the field.
for sure. One example is the evolution of construction management being integrated into architectural firms.
Oh, that's interesting.
In the past, architects were prohibited from being involved in construction because of potential conflicts of interest.
Right.
But as the industry changed, ethical codes adapted to this new model while still maintaining safeguards to ensure ethical practice.
That's a really great example of how ethical codes need to be dynamic and responsive to the changing nature of the profession itself. Speaking of adapting to change, I know you wanted to talk about the self-governing nature of the architectural profession here in Canada.
Yeah, it's a unique thing we have here. Each province and territory has its own association of architects.
Okay.
And these associations have a lot of power. They set the criteria for becoming licensed, they regulate conduct, investigate complaints, and can even administer disciplinary actions if an architect is found guilty of professional misconduct.
Wow, that's serious business. And it sounds like architects are essentially policing themselves.
You could say that. It's self-regulation to maintain the public's trust. And just like with any profession that impacts public safety, there have to be consequences for those who violate these ethical codes.
So what kind of consequences are we talking about here?
It runs the gamut, from a formal reprimand to fine suspension, or even in the most serious cases, revocation of an architect's license.
That makes sense. There needs to be a system in place to protect the public and ensure that architects are held accountable for their actions. It's similar to how doctors have their medical boards.
Exactly. And just like doctors have continuing education requirements, architects also need to be constantly learning. The field changes all the time, with new technologies, sustainability practices, and emerging ethical considerations.
So even after you become a licensed architect, the learning never stops.
Mm.
It's continuous professional development. You mentioned those emerging ethical considerations, and that's something I'm excited to delve into. What are some of the key trends shaping the future of architectural ethics?
It's exciting to see how architectural ethics are expanding beyond traditional concerns. We're seeing a much greater emphasis on social and environmental responsibility now.
It's like the whole concept of corporate social responsibility is finding its way into design.
Exactly. Architects are being challenged to think about the impact of their work on society and the environment.
Right. It's not just about designing a beautiful and functional building anymore. It's about considering the bigger picture, the consequences for the community and the planet.
Yeah, and a perfect example of this is the increasing use of social clauses in architectural contracts.
Okay. Can you elaborate on that a bit? What does that look like?
Sure. These clauses might require things like prioritizing local labor for a project, ensuring fair wages, using sustainably sourced materials from ethical suppliers.
So it's like baking those ethical considerations right into the building process from day one.
Yes. Another major trend is the awareness of environmental rights and architects' role in fighting climate change.
Hmm.
Organizations like the American Institute of Architects have made sustainable design a top priority, urging their members to go above and beyond.
Beyond just meeting those basic building codes.
Right, because buildings have a huge impact on the environment for
Mm.
their energy consumption
Yeah.
and the materials used.
Yeah.
But this can create some ethical challenges, when you have regulations promoting environmental protection, but then encounter clients or projects where those goals are difficult to achieve.
So then it's a balancing act, trying to reconcile those ethical obligations with the realities of a project.
For sure. And that leads to the third major trend, the growing focus on human rights in architecture.
This one seems very broad. How do human rights apply to architecture specifically?
Well, architecture shapes our lives. It determines our access to shelter, our sense of safety and security, our ability to be part of a community.
So human rights in architecture go beyond just ensuring accessibility.
Definitely. It also includes broader considerations like cultural rights, the right to adequate housing, even the rights of construction workers, particularly on international projects.
Right, where labor standards might not be as strict.
Yeah.
It's inspiring to see how the field of architecture is evolving to address these really important social and ethical issues. It's no longer just about aesthetics and functionality. It's about creating a built environment that is just and equitable for everyone.
That's the goal. And speaking of inspiring principles, we should mention the tradition of oaths and declarations in architecture.
Oh, yes. Like the Hippocratic Oath we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Some architectural associations have their own oath that members pledge to uphold.
I'm curious about the language used in those oaths. What kind of commitments are typically included?
They vary, but one example is the Architectural Institute of British Columbia's oath.
Okay.
It includes the line, "and I will thereby improve the environment." It really shows the architect's responsibility to create spaces that are good for both people and the planet.
That's so powerful. And it ties into everything we've been discussing. It seems like these considerations are at the center of architecture.
Definitely. To understand these core principles even better, let's look at the codes of conduct from the AIBC and the Saskatchewan Association of Architects.
Okay.
They provide a foundation for ethical practice.
Great. Let's break them down one by one. Where do we start?
Well, first and foremost is competence.
Okay.
Architects need to be knowledgeable and skilled in their profession.
Yeah, architects need to know what they're doing.
Right. But it goes beyond just having those technical skills. It's about being up to date with practices and knowing the limits of your expertise. You're responsible for the safety of the people who use the buildings you design. Incompetence can have serious consequences.
Absolutely. So competence is really the foundation of ethical practice. What's next?
Conflict of interest.
Yeah.
This ensures that an architect's decisions are for the client's benefit and not influenced by personal gain or biases.
Okay. I can see how this one can get tricky in practice. Can you give us some examples of what this means for architects?
Sure. The source material has some good examples. Let's say an architect has a stake in a company that makes windows.
Okay.
If they specify those windows for a client without disclosing their financial interest, that's a conflict of interest.
Ah, I see. It's about being transparent and making sure that the architect's choices are based on what's truly best for the project, not their own personal gain.
Exactly. And these conflicts aren't always about financial gain. They could also be about favoritism or letting biases influence design decisions.
Gotcha.
You need to avoid those situations and be open and honest with clients about any potential conflicts.
So honesty and transparency are at the heart of a lot of these considerations.
For sure. And that brings us to our next principle, full disclosure.
Okay, so if there's a conflict of interest, it needs to be disclosed. But what else falls under full disclosure?
It's about being truthful and transparent in everything you do as an architect.
Okay.
So you can't make misleading claims about your qualifications, and you also have to report any violations of building regulations by a client, even if it might jeopardize the project.
Wow, that's tough. It's about putting those ethical obligations above personal gain.
It is. It's about maintaining the public's trust and the integrity of the profession.
Okay. So we've got competence, conflict of interest, and full disclosure. What's the next one on the list?
Compliance with laws.
This one seems pretty self-explanatory. Architects have to follow the law, but I'm guessing it goes deeper than just building codes.
You're right. It's about conducting your business ethically.
Okay.
So you can't do anything illegal or unethical to secure projects or get an advantage.
So playing by the rules.
Yes, being a responsible member of society.
And upholding the law, both in letter and in spirit.
Exactly. And finally, we have professional conduct, which covers a broad range of behaviors beyond the other principles.
Can you give us some specific examples of what that means in practice?
Sure, it includes properly supervising staff, avoiding actions that harm other architects, and adhering to the guidelines for competitions.
Okay, so it's about treating everyone with respect, acting with integrity,
Yeah,
and maintaining the honor and dignity of the profession.
exactly. Taken together, these principles provide a solid framework for ethical decision-making in architecture.
This has been really insightful. We've talked about consequences for misconduct.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about the disciplinary process itself. How does that work in practice?
It's a very rigorous and formal process. Those provincial and territorial associations we mentioned earlier, they have a quasi-judicial role. They need to follow due process, like in a court of law.
So it's not a case of someone complaining and the architect is immediately penalized.
Not at all. There's a thorough investigation,
Right.
a formal review, and if the complaint is valid, it goes to a disciplinary committee.
And what happens at that stage?
It could involve a hearing, much like a court proceeding.
Oh, wow.
The architect has the right to a lawyer, and both sides can present their arguments. It's serious because the outcome can impact an architect's career.
So it's a system with checks and balances
Yeah.
to protect both the person complaining and the architect.
Yes. What are the potential outcomes of those hearings?
Right. What could happen?
The disciplinary committee could find the architect guilty of misconduct and impose penalties,
Okay.
which could be anything from a reprimand to a fine suspension or even permanently revoking their license. On the other hand, if they're found not guilty, the complaint is dismissed and their reputation is cleared.
So the stakes are pretty high.
They are.
And that makes sense, given the impact their work can have on people's lives and safety. It's reassuring to know those associations have this process in place to ensure accountability and uphold those ethical standards.
Absolutely. And typically, the outcome of these hearings, whether guilty or not guilty, is made public.
Okay, why is that?
That transparency reinforces the ethical standards, shows accountability to the public,
Makes sense.
and it acts as a deterrent to future misconduct. It's also a form of continuing education for other architects.
Oh, I see. They can learn from the experiences of their peers
Exactly. It's a real-world case study.
in architectural ethics.
Right, reinforcing the idea that these aren't just theoretical concepts. They have real-world consequences
Absolutely.
that can shape an architect's entire career.
It really does highlight that, yeah, those ethical breaches don't just go unnoticed.
Exactly. And this whole idea of accountability brings us to another interesting aspect, the architect's seal.
Oh, right. Yeah, I've heard of this, but I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it is. What is an architect's seal, and why is it so important?
It's more than just like a signature. It's a symbol of responsibility. When an architect puts their seal on a document, they're saying, I did this and I take responsibility for it.
So it's a way of showing that the project has been properly overseen by a qualified professional.
Exactly. It means they've reviewed everything, checked that it complies with all the codes and regulations, and basically they're putting their name on the line for it.
And are there strict rules about using this seal? I imagine so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Misusing the seal is a big deal.
Yeah.
It's a serious breach of conduct and can have consequences.
It's not just a formality.
No, it's a legal thing.
This all really emphasizes how important ethics are in architecture.
It really does.
It's not just about being a talented designer.
No.
It's about integrity and accountability,
Yeah.
a commitment to the public good.
And speaking of that commitment to the public good, there's a really common dilemma architects face.
What's that?
That tension between what a client wants and what's best for the community or the environment.
That's tough. I can see how those things can clash. How do architects deal with that?
It takes careful consideration and a lot of communication.
Okay.
You have to be willing to advocate for those ethical principles.
Even when it means having tough conversations.
Even then.
So it's about finding that balance between serving the client and also doing right by the community and the environment.
Exactly. Can you give us an example?
Yeah. What does that look like in a real project?
Sure. Imagine a client who wants to build a big, energy-guzzling building that would overshadow a nearby park.
Okay.
An architect who's concerned about the environment and the community might need to push back on that.
Right. So they need to explain why that's not a good idea.
Exactly. They might suggest different designs, ones that are more sustainable and have less impact.
So it's not about just saying no to the client.
No, it's about being a problem solver.
Finding solutions.
Right. Finding solutions that work for everyone?
Solutions that align with those ethical obligations. This
Exactly.
all ties back to those trends we were talking about,
It does.
especially the focus on social and environmental responsibility.
It seems like architects are being called upon to be leaders in these areas.
It's a big responsibility,
It is.
but also a big opportunity to make a real difference.
Exactly. And it all comes down to what we've been talking about today, the importance of ethics in architecture.
Because ultimately, if you don't have that ethical foundation, all the design skills in the world won't matter if the project isn't good for everyone.
Well said. Ethics is like a compass for architects, guiding them towards creating spaces that are not just beautiful and functional, but also just and sustainable.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. I have a whole new understanding of how important ethics are in architecture.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a really interesting field and one that's constantly evolving.
Before we move on to the last part of our conversation, is there anything else you'd like to add about those responsibilities to the community or the environment?
You know what? I think it's worth noting that a lot of these ethical considerations are very specific to the place and the people involved.
So what might be ethical in one context
Yeah,
might be different somewhere else.
exactly. You have to be sensitive to those differences.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Imagine working on a project in a remote indigenous community.
Okay.
You'd need to do more than just follow basic sustainability rules.
Right. You'd have to really understand their culture and values.
Exactly. You have to make sure your design reflects those values.
That's a really good point. So ethical considerations aren't one size fits all.
right.
They have to be adapted to each unique situation.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important responsibility, the architect's responsibility to themselves.
Oh, interesting. We've talked about clients and the community.
Yeah.
But what about the architect's own well-being and sense of purpose?
That's a crucial piece that often gets overlooked.
Yeah,
Architects face so much pressure.
I imagine so. Tight deadlines, demanding clients.
Right. And those pressures can really test their ethical boundaries.
And it's easy to lose sight of your own values when things get tough.
Exactly. So architects need to have ways to stay grounded in those values, to keep that sense of integrity even when it's hard.
So what can they do? How do they build that strength?
One important thing is self-reflection.
Okay.
Take time to think about your own values,
Yeah.
the things that are really important to you.
It's like creating a personal mission statement.
Exactly, a set of guiding principles.
And that's something you should revisit regularly, right?
It should be an ongoing practice.
Yeah.
As you grow and change,
Okay.
your understanding of ethics might change too, so it's important to keep learning.
To keep that conversation with yourself going.
Exactly. And another thing that helps is seeking out different viewpoints.
Mhm.
Talk to other architects. Read about ethical issues.
So you don't get stuck in just one way of thinking.
Exactly, because we all have blind spots.
Right. We don't always see the whole picture.
Having those diverse perspectives can help you make better decisions.
And it sounds like that extends to engaging with the community too.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just get feedback from the community.
You have to actually build relationships
Right. You have to understand their needs and really listen to their concerns.
and incorporate that feedback into the design process.
Exactly. It's about working together.
Creating a sense of shared ownership.
Yes. And this also requires humility from the architect.
Okay.
They have to be confident in their skills,
Yep.
but also humble enough to know when they need help.
To be open to learning from others.
Exactly. Because everyone makes mistakes.
And it's important to learn from those mistakes.
Exactly. Humility is about being willing to grow and improve.
And we also have to talk about resilience.
That's a crucial one. Architects deal with a lot of pressure.
Tight deadlines, budgets, difficult clients.
Right. Can be really tough on them.
So they need to be able to handle that pressure.
Exactly. They need resilience to stick to their ethics even when things are hard.
So it's not just about knowing what's right. It's about having the strength to do it.
Exactly. And that resilience comes from experience, from having mentors, from taking care of yourself.
Right, from having a good support system.
Exactly.
This conversation has been amazing. It really shows how much architects impact the world around us. They're not just designing buildings.
Right.
They're shaping communities and influencing how we live our lives.
They have a big impact on the environment, too.
And with that influence comes a responsibility to act ethically.
To use your skills to make the world a better place.
Because ethics isn't just a set of rules.
No.
It's a way of life.
Exactly. It's about making decisions that are good for everyone.
Decisions that create a world that's just and sustainable.
Well said. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about.
Okay.
What's that? We've talked about responsibility to the client, the community, the environment.
Yeah.
But what about responsibility to yourself?
To your own well-being and happiness.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this part of the conversation, I want you to think about this. How can architects stay true to themselves and find fulfillment in their work while also dealing with all the challenges of this profession?
It's a really important question, and a great way to transition into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore those personal and philosophical dimensions of ethics in architecture. It really is a question that's worth thinking about, as we wrap up this deep dive today.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to circle back to that personal aspect, that internal guidance that shapes an architect's choices.
Absolutely. We've talked about all the codes and those external pressures, but when it comes down to it, ethical decisions are made by individuals. So how can architects nurture that inner compass and ensure it's leading them in the right direction?
That's a great question.
Self-reflection is crucial. You have to make time to examine your own values and beliefs, the things that truly matter to you, both as a professional and a person.
So it's like developing a personal mission statement, a set of principles that guide your choices, even when faced with those ethical gray areas.
Exactly. And that self-reflection shouldn't be a one-time thing. It needs to be a continuous process, a constant dialogue with yourself as you face new challenges and your understanding of the world changes.
So staying curious, open to learning and growing, continually refining your ethical framework.
Yes, exactly. And another really important piece is seeking out diverse perspectives.
Okay. How do you do that?
Talk to other architects. Engage with people from different backgrounds and fields. Read articles and books that make you question your assumptions. Expose yourself to a variety of viewpoints.
So you don't get stuck in your own way of thinking.
Right, because it's easy to get caught in your own bubble and miss the bigger picture. We all have those blind spots.
Yeah, we do.
And surrounding yourself with people who offer different perspectives can help you see those blind spots and make more well-rounded decisions.
It's about recognizing that making those ethical decisions isn't a solo act. It really benefits from collaboration and that open dialogue. And we touched on community engagement earlier. It seems like that plays a role here as well.
It does, because engaging with the community goes beyond simply gathering feedback. It's about building relationships, understanding different viewpoints, and fostering a sense of shared ownership over the project.
Right. So the architect isn't the only expert. The best solutions often come from working together.
Exactly. And this requires humility from the architect.
Okay.
They need to have confidence in their skills.
Of course.
But also be humble enough to know when to ask for help.
When to learn from others.
Exactly, because even the best architects make mistakes.
Yeah. And it's how you handle those mistakes that matters.
Exactly. Humility is about being willing to always grow and improve, to see ethical growth as an ongoing journey, not a destination.
This leads to something I think a lot of architects think about. How do you balance those personal ethical ideals with the demands of reality? Things like client pressures, deadlines, budgets, all of that.
That's a great point, and that's where resilience becomes crucial. Architects need to have that strong inner core, a solid understanding of their values, so they can weather those challenges and stay true to themselves.
So it's not just about knowing the right thing to do, but having the strength to actually do it, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And that resilience is developed over time through experienced mentorship, self-care, and having a strong support network.
Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive. We've explored the foundations of architectural ethics, the challenges and dilemmas, and ultimately the profound impact architects have on the world around us.
It's clear that ethics isn't just an afterthought. It's at the very heart of what it means to be an architect.
It's about shaping the built environment in a way that benefits not just us today, but future generations as well.
That's it. So as we wrap up, what's the one thing you want listeners to take away from all of this?
Yeah. What's that key takeaway?
I want them to remember that architecture isn't just about the buildings. It's about people, communities, and the health of our planet. Every decision an architect makes matters.
It's about using your skills to create a world that is not just beautiful, but also just sustainable and inspiring.
Very well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the ever-evolving world of architectural ethics.